Lee, in Richard Dawkins' wildly popular book, The God Delusion, he makes this claim. He says, the historical evidence that Jesus claimed any sort of divine status is minimal. In your investigation and studies for the case for the real Jesus, what did you discover on this? What's your response to that?
Yeah, it's just one of many assertions that Richard Dawkins makes in his book that is just not true. And it's something that I believe when I was an atheist, so I can understand where he's coming from, because I used to think that there is no historical data that shows that Jesus even claimed to be the Son of God.
You kind of want it to be true, right?
Yeah, I did want it to be true, because I didn't want there to be a God. But I tried to investigate it with an open mind and in a historical way that really looked at tests that historians would apply to the historical record. So what I did is I went back to the earliest gospel. So historians like stuff that's close to the events, right? Well, let's go back to the first gospel written, the Gospel of Mark, which of course is based on the eyewitness accounts of the Apostle Peter. Now, when you go back to that earliest account, do you find Jesus ever claiming to be the Son of God? As Dawkins said, he didn't, or there's no minimal historical evidence that he did. Well, on the contrary, the first thing you notice in the Gospel of Mark is the number one way that Jesus referred to himself was as the Son of Man. And when I first read that as an atheist, I thought, well, there you go. That just shows that he just thought he was a human being. He's only claiming to be a man.
Yeah, that's the natural reading of that.
That's the natural surface reading of it. But when you really understand what Jesus was saying, what you understand was he was claiming in that statement not just to be a human being, but he was applying to himself the Son of Man passage from Daniel chapter 7 in the Old Testament. In that passage, the Son of Man is not merely a human being, but he is divine in nature. He has authority, he has sovereignty, he's worshiped by all people, he's eternal, he judges humankind. All of those are attributes of God.
So that's all loaded in that little phrase, Son of Man.
In that phrase, Son of Man, Jesus' audience understood he was claiming to be more than just a human being. He was making a divine claim. Now, that's kind of a way that he did it that is just one of several. There's some ways he did it that were a little subtle. For instance, in Mark chapter 6, we have the famous story where Jesus walks in the water. And the disciples see him, and most accounts quote Jesus as saying, "Fear not, it is I." But if you go back to the Greek in which the New Testament is written, that's not the best translation. What he actually said was, "Fear not, I am." Well, what is I am?
The name of God.
Is the name of God. Then in Exodus chapter 3, that's where God revealed himself to Moses with the words, I am. So that's another subtle way in which Jesus was communicating.
And probably not so subtle to the people of that time.
They got it,
Yeah.
but then again, he wasn't shouting on a rooftop, but
Yeah.
he was making it known. Now, you can go to a more obvious way in which he claimed it during the trial of Jesus. Again, we're in the Gospel of Mark, and the high priest says, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" And the first two words out of his mouth are, "I am." And then he says, "And you will see me sitting on the right hand of the Mighty One and coming in the clouds of heaven." Those are references to, again, Daniel chapter 7, the Son of Man passage where he is a divine figure. Now, how does the high priest respond? He says, what more evidence do we need? He's committed blasphemy.
Yeah.
And he rips his clothing in anger that Jesus has committed blasphemy. What does he mean by blasphemy? Because he is claiming to be God.
Yeah.
So this was not lost on this first century audience. Do we have no historical or minimal historical evidence he claimed to be the
Sounds
Son of God?
maximal to me.
It's not maximal all through the Gospels. Look at the Gospel of John, chapter 10, verse 30, where Jesus says, "I and the Father are one." And the word in Greek used there for one means one in essence. And how did the audience understand what Jesus was saying? They picked up stones to kill him. Why? Because they said, "You, being a mere man, claim to be God." So Mark,
And he didn't deny it.
He didn't deny it. Indeed, he proved it by returning from the dead. So this assertion by Richard Dawkins, who, by the way, is not an historian, he's a zoologist. He's making an historical claim that there's minimal evidence that Jesus claimed to be the Son of God. Just not true. Jesus made it clear, sometimes in a subtle way, sometimes in a completely overt way, but repeatedly in these writings which historians have tested and determined to be reliable, that date back right there to the first century. The Gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, again and again, he makes clear he's making the claim he's the Son of God. Now, having said that, and having disproven Dawkins, we have to say anybody can claim to be the Son of God. You could, I could, anybody can make the claim.
I've met people that made that claim.
I have too. When I was an investigative reporter at the Chicago Tribune, we did a lot of work in mental institutions.
You probably met
investigating
many
things.
Jesuses.
I met many people who claim to be God. There's no shortage of them.
Yeah.
But why didn't anybody believe him? Because they didn't have any credentials.
Right.
Jesus had credentials. His greatest credential is that he died and he returned from the dead. And in my book, The Case of the Real Jesus, I set up forth the evidence for those things. And if he not only claimed it, contrary to Dawkins, if he claimed it, and we can know that historically, and if he did return from the dead, and Mark, I'm telling you, the historical evidence, even if you base it on the minimal facts that virtually every scholar, including the skeptics, will accept as being true, which is how I present it in The Case for the Real Jesus, we have a solid case that the resurrection is true. Well, what's the verdict then? To me, the verdict in The Case for the Real Jesus is the real Jesus is who we claim to be, the one and only, the unique Son of God.